This is a Fonzie Studio podcast. Welcome to Tales from the First Nations. I'm Jay Idle, and every week I'll share with you a tale and ancient wisdom of the native tribes of North America. I'll be joined by my cats, Dawa and Fonzie, who will undoubtedly make their presence known at some point, so I might as well just list them as co-hosts. We hope you'll enjoy the tales and wisdom, raise your vibration, and enrich your life with us every week. Welcome, friends. Welcome to the 87th episode of Tales from the First Nations. I'm your host, Jay Idle. I remember when I was a kid, we watched the old Davy Crockett film from Disney, and I thought it would be so cool to have a coonskin cap. I never got one, but in honor of my childhood dream, we'll dedicate today's episode to the raccoon. In many Native American cultures, raccoons are associated with cleverness, adaptability, and survival skills. Their ability to thrive in diverse environments and use their dexterous front paws made them symbols of intelligence and resourcefulness. For tribes in the eastern woodlands, such as the Abenaki, Algonquin, and Iroquois people, raccoons were familiar animals in daily life, providing fur and occasionally food, while also serving as reminders of the importance of curiosity, problem-solving, and learning from one's surroundings. In stories and spirituality, raccoons often appear as trickster figures, like humorous teachers, most notably the Abenaki character Azaban, the raccoon. Unlike more powerful tricksters, raccoon figures tend to be playful and flawed, teaching lessons through mistakes rather than malice. Spiritually, the raccoon's masked face and nocturnal habits connect to the themes of hidden identity, transformation, and seeing beyond appearances. These stories encourage balance, celebrating cleverness and creativity while warning against greed, deception, and carelessness, reinforcing moral values within the community. We have 3 stories for you today, and one of them will be about Azaban the raccoon. However, let us begin with a Menominee legend. The Menominee people were a tribe originally from the forested regions of what is now Wisconsin and parts of Michigan. Their name comes from a word meaning the people of the wild rice, reflecting the central role that wild rice played in their diet, culture, and economy. The Menominee have a long history of sustainable land stewardship, fishing and hunting, and they are known for maintaining much of their ancestral forest through careful management. Today, the Menominee Indian tribe of Wisconsin continues to preserve its language, traditions, and strong cultural identity. This is The Deceived Blind Man. There was a large settlement on the shore of a lake, and among its people were 2 very old blind men. It was decided to remove these men to the opposite side of the lake where they might live in safety. The people thought the settlement was unsafe, as the settlement was exposed to the attack of enemies and feared the blind men might easily be captured or killed. So the relations of the old men got a canoe, some food, a kettle, and a bowl and started across the lake. There, they built for them a wigwam in a grove some distance from the water. A line was stretched from the door of the wigwam to a post in the water so that they would have no difficulty in helping themselves. The food and vessels were put into the wigwam, and after the relations of the old men promised them that they would call often and keep them provided with everything that was needed, they returned to their settlement. The 2 old blind men now began to take care of themselves. On one day, one of them would do the cooking while the other went for water, and on the next day, they would change about in their work, so that their labors were evenly divided. As they knew just how much food they required for each meal, the quantity prepared was equally divided, but was eaten out of one bowl which they had. There, they lived in contentment for several years. But one day a raccoon, which was following the water's edge, looking for crawfish, came to the line which had been stretched from the lake to the wigwam. The raccoon thought it rather curious to find a cord where he had not observed one before, and he wondered to himself, "What is this? I think I shall follow this cord and see where it leads." So he followed the path along which the cord was stretched until he came to the wigwam. Approaching very cautiously, he went up to the entrance where he saw the two old men asleep on the ground, their heads at the door and their feet directed towards the heap of hot coals within. The raccoon sniffed about and soon found there was something good to eat within the wigwam, but he decided not to enter at once for fear of waking the old men. So he retired a short distance to hide himself and see what they would do. Presently the old men awoke, and one said to the other, "My friend, I am getting hungry. Let us prepare some food." "Very well," replied his companion. "You go down to the lake and fetch some water while I get the fire started." The raccoon heard this conversation, and wishing to deceive the old man, immediately ran to the water, untied the cord from the post, and carried it to a clump of bushes where he tied it. When the old man came along with his kettle to get water, he stumbled around the brush until he found the end of the cord. Then he began to dip his kettle down upon the ground for water. Not finding any, he slowly returned and said to his companion, "We surely shall die, because the lake is dried up, and the brush is grown where we used to get water. What shall we do?" "That cannot be," responded his companion, "for we have not been asleep long enough for the brush to grow upon the lake bed. Let me go out to try if I can get some water." So taking the kettle from his friend, he started off. As soon as the first man had returned to the wigwam, the raccoon took the cord back and tied it to where he had found it, then waited to see the result. The second old man now came along, entered the lake, and getting his kettle full of water, returned to the wigwam, saying as he entered, "My friend, you told me what was not true. There's water enough, for here, you see, I have a kettle full." The other could not understand this at all, and wondered what had caused this deception. The raccoon approached the wigwam and entered to await the cooking of the food. When it was ready, the pieces of meat, for there were 8 of them, were put into the bowl, and the old man sat on the ground facing each other with the bowl between them. Each took a piece of meat, and they began to talk of various things and were enjoying themselves. The raccoon now quietly removed 4 pieces of meat from the bowl and began to eat them, enjoying the feast even more than the old blind men. Presently, one of them reached into the bowl to get another piece of meat, and finding only 2 pieces remained, said, "My friend, you must be very hungry to eat so rapidly. I have had but 1 piece, and there are but 2 pieces left." The other replied, "I have not taken them, but suspect you have eaten them yourself." Whereupon the other replied more angrily than before. Thus they argued, and the raccoon, desiring to have more sport, tapped each of them on the face. The old men, each believing the other had struck him, began to fight, rolling over the floor of the wigwam, upsetting the bowl and the kettle, and causing the fire to be scattered. The raccoon then took the 2 remaining pieces of meat and made his exit from the wigwam, laughing. Whereupon the old men instantly ceased their strife, for they now knew they had been deceived. The raccoon then remarked to them, "I have played a nice trick on you. You should not find fault with each other so easily." Then the raccoon continued his crawfish hunting along the lake shore. Another trickster teaching us the value of friendship. It is a pity that the 2 old men were so quick to turn on each other. If only they had trusted each other more, they could have resolved the problem sooner and maybe kept a little bit more of their meal. In addition to being a trickster, Racoon can sometimes be a downright thief, as we see in our next story, How Racoon Got His Coat. This is the tale of how Raven the trickster was once himself tricked, and of what he did when he found out who tricked him. One bright and sunny dawn, many years ago, Racoon was trotting back to his burrow after a long night's successful hunting, when he came across Raven's long house at the forest. Racoon saw Raven himself through the longhouse half-open doorway, in fact, but he could not quite see what Raven was doing. It was all very mysterious. Now, in those days, Racoon didn't look much like he does today. In those days, Racoon's fur was one color, smooth, glossy gray from nose to tail. But Racoon was just as curious then as ever. Rather than go about his business the way any well-behaved animal would, Racoon decided to find out just what Raven was up to. He crept quietly closer to the side of Raven's longhouse so he could see what Raven was doing without himself being seen. Peering through a chink in Raven's longhouse wall, Racoon could see that Raven had taken out a few objects of treasure that he'd been hiding. As you know, Raven loves to collect shiny objects. They were in a great cedar chest at the foot of his sleeping mat, and he was cleaning and arranging them with care. On this particular day, Raven was admiring 5 beautiful silver rings. A matched set that he had spirited away from a young squaw while she was washing her clothing in the stream near Raven's home. Racoon saw the rings and coveted them so much, for he had always been much like Raven in his love for bright, shiny objects. But he knew that Raven would never willingly give him the rings. So Racoon slipped quietly away from the longhouse and went back to his burrow to think of a plan to steal the rings from Raven without getting caught. Late the next night, when the moon had risen and set and Raven was fast asleep, Racoon came creeping back to Raven's longhouse through the dark woods. This time, Racoon was wearing a mask to hide his eyes, and he carried a torch close to his chest, making the light leap up and illuminate his face from below. As you can well imagine, this made Racoon look very frightening. Racoon crept up on the window of Raven's long home and began moaning in a most ghostly voice. Oh, ooh, ooh. Raven awoke with a squawk of fright and saw Racoon's horrible torchlight mask peering in his window. Ooh, moaned Racoon again. Raven leaped from his sleeping mat. Racoon hastily put out his torch and ran around the corner of Raven's longhouse in the darkness to enter the front door, counting on Raven to run out the back in panic. But Raven was naturally brave and recovered quickly from being frightened. Instead of running out the back, as Racoon had intended, Raven picked up a club and ran out the front. Although Racoon was surprised by Raven's quick action, he was not so surprised that he forgot what he had come for. It was a close shave, but Racoon was able to reverse course and elude Raven in the darkness without being seen, while Raven went crashing through the undergrowth around the longhouse looking for his attacker. Quickly running around the back of Raven's longhouse, Racoon scurried inside and opened up Raven's cedar chest. The beautiful rings Racoon had coveted lay on top. Racoon discovered that he couldn't pick up the rings and hold his torch at the same time, and he couldn't just leave the torch behind. He needed it to make his way back through the dark forest without the moon in the sky to provide light. Thinking quickly, Racoon took his long bushy tail and slid each ring onto it in turn. Just as he got the 5th ring onto his tail, he heard Raven running back through the bushes. Racoon closed the cedar chest, lit his torch again from Raven's fire, and scurried out the back of the longhouse unseen just before Raven burst in through the front. Grumbling and squawking in frustration, the exhausted Raven went back to his bed. Racoon was long gone. He scurried back through the forest, through the damp underbrush, skirting the sulphurous hot springs that marked the trail to his burrow, where he removed the silver rings from his tail and hid them in his own secret place. When Raven awoke the next day, he noticed that his cedar chest was not quite in the same place as he'd left it. His first thought was for his treasures. Pulling the cedar chest out and opening it, Raven saw that his prized silver rings were missing. Raven knew then he had been tricked, that the ghost he'd seen last night had not been a ghost at all, but one of the animals in the forest. But Raven did not know which one. Raven went to all the animals of the forest, to bear, to chipmunk, to badger, to rabbit, even eagle, but without having any luck. Finally, late in the afternoon, Raven came to Racoon's burrow. "Hello," called Raven. "Racoon?" Are you in there?" Racoon trembled in fear, but hid it with gruffness as he came to the mouth of his burrow. "What do you want, Raven? I was sleeping." Racoon considered including a yawn for dramatic effect, but decided against it. "Out late last night, were you?" Now Racoon did yawn. He couldn't help it. "No, I've been sleeping in my burrow. I always do during the day. What do you want?" Racoon's act of innocence was very well done, although Raven was by nature a very suspicious animal. He was convinced. "Oh, nothing," Raven sighed. "Well, then I'll just go back to sleep." Racoon turned to go back into the burrow, and at that moment Raven caught sight of Racoon's tail. There were 5 black rings of tarnish on the gray fur. "Oh," said Raven, pointing to Racoon's tail. Racoon whirled around and around, trying to get a glimpse of it. When Racoon saw the evidence of his theft displayed on his tail for all to see, he hung his head in shame and confessed his whole plan to Raven. Raven chuckled ruefully at the way he'd been taken in. That didn't stop him from being angry, though. After Racoon had gone and sheepishly inside his burrow and brought out the rings he'd stolen, Raven sat him down on a tree stump and passed judgment. "Racoon, from now on you shall bear the marks of your theft, as a reminder to you and all the creatures of the forest. Forevermore, your tail shall bear the marks of the rings you stole from me. Your paws shall be black to remind you of the torch you held, and you shall wear a mask like the one you wore to scare me. I have spoken." And it was so. Then Raven went back to his longhouse to hide his treasures in a safer place, and Racoon, after suffering many jeers from his friends in the forest, eventually came to love his distinctive new coat even more than the old one. But Racoon never really learned his lesson. Although he never again tried to take anything from Raven, he still comes to us sometimes, like a thief in the night, wearing his mask and markings and looking for something good he can steal. Well, now we know that Racoon's markings are earned. This is his second story and his second act of thievery. In the beginning, we talked a little bit about Asbon, the raccoon, so we'll finish our episode with a story about him battling a waterfall. This is the Abenaki story of Asbon, the raccoon, and the waterfall. One day, Asbon the raccoon was walking around. There were many things which Asbon could have done back in his own lodge. However, those were boring things, everyday things, things which he was supposed to do. Asbon would much rather do things he wasn't supposed to do, especially on a fine day like this one. His long fingers were just itching to get into something. As always, Asbon was looking for trouble. As he walked along through the woods, he heard the chirping of baby birds from the trees above him. "Little birds," he called up, "come down and play with your Uncle Asbon. I will teach you some new games." The mother birds, though, looked out of their nests with suspicion. They would not let the little birds go and play with Asbon. "Be careful," they'd say to their young ones. "Asbon is a nest robber. You cannot trust him." "Silly birds," Asbon said to himself. "Don't they know I just like to play with baby birds and birds' eggs? It isn't my fault if playing makes me hungry sometimes." He looked up at the tree and smiled, but he could see that he would have no luck there today. The birds were being too watchful. "Don't worry, little birds," Asbon called back over his shoulder. "I will be back another day." Asbon walked and walked. Soon he was in a valley which led through the hills. Then he cocked his head and listened. He could hear something. It sounded like many people shouting. "Now what is that?" Asbon said. "I shall have to go and see." He began to follow the sound, which seemed to be coming from the end of the valley. The closer he came, the louder the sound became. Finally, pushing his way through some brush, Asbon found himself on the edge of a cliff, looking down at the Winooski River, where it roared and roared. It made a sound like the voices of many people, all shouting together. "Aha!" said Asbon, speaking to the waterfall. "So you think you can shout loudly, do you?" The waterfall did not answer him. It just kept pouring down, splashing on the rocks below. "Do you think you can outshout me?" said Asban. "I am Asban, the Great One, you know." But the waterfall did not answer him. "Do you think you can ignore me?" Asban said. "Listen, I shall outshout you." Then Asban shouted, "Eee!" But his little voice was nowhere near as loud as the waterfall. Asban said, "I see that I shall have to shout louder." He took a deep breath and shouted even more loudly, "Eee!" But his little voice was still drowned out by the roar of the waterfall. "I shall have to get closer," Asban said. He climbed down closer to the edge of the falls, took a very deep breath, and shouted again, "Eee!" But his little voice was still lost in the sound of the falls. Asban said, "I shall have to lean out further." Then he took a very, very deep breath, filled his lungs with as much air as he could, and shouted, "Eee!" He shouted so loud and so long that he became dizzy and lost his balance. Down he fell into the water. Before he could rescue himself, he was swept over the falls. It takes quite a set of lungs to outshout a waterfall, and poor Asban just didn't have it in him. Now, if he had made his wife or mother angry enough, she might have had it in her. I give gratitude for you joining us today and listening to our stories. I hope you enjoyed them and that you'll join us again next week. Go in peace, return in peace, and may you be well. Our first story, The Deceived Blind Men, comes from nativelanguages.org and can be found in Stith Thompson's 1929 collection of Tales of the North American Indian. Our second story, How Racoon Got His Coat, can be found on oocities.org, courtesy of Crawdad Creek Wildlife Rehab. Our final story, Asban the Raccoon and the Waterfall, comes from northernneweenglandtribes.weebly.com. For more great stories and legends, join me next week for another story here on Tales from the First Nations. I'm Jay Idle, and I'll talk to you next time. If you enjoy the podcast, please like and review us in your podcast service so we might grow further, and feel free to recommend us to your friends and family as well. Music is provided by my dear friend Scott Brocklesby, who created this beautiful song you're listening to, and our podcast Image of the Moon was provided by Mark Lawton. We will see you next time. All right, that's it. How'd we do, Dawa? Phones? Excellent. Then I'll share it.